Thank you for coming to this seminar. The seminar is going to be about political aspects of peer-to-peer systems, peer-to-peer peer production also. And we have 4 speakers, so this is the order we are going to follow. So I'm going to start with my first presentation. Just a few words of introduction. This seminar was organized in order to foster debate. So we, the only thing we have asked ourselves is to be a bit, let's say, provocative. And this is not the outcome of a very systematic research process, but let's say, a more formalized way to put some discussions we've been having in the last time, in the last months. And, well, just an opportunity to share with you some ideas and to foster debate after the 4 that we expect 4 short presentations of about 10-15 minutes at maximum. So, okay, I'm going to begin with mine. And what I'm going to do is basically to talk about this thing called Californian ideology, which is something that has been more or less built in the last decade around internet issues, very different issues, but that I think it's very present in many accounts of peer production, academic accounts and non-academic accounts. As you know, peer production is something that is usually, a concept that is usually used for describing things like Wikipedia, free software, also open hardware and many other initiatives right now. It is not a very well-defined concept, and in fact, it is also very debated right now what kind of social implications peer production have. Some say peer production is just an alternative mode of production in a very standard way with some revolutionary potential for some. Some say it is a new form of liberal economics. Let's say a more kind of human or benevolent capitalistic way of doing things. And in fact, in today's work portal, there is a post or news about collaborative economics, which says that the commons economy, it's just a more social responsible form of capitalism. This is said by a colleague of ours in this new. Some others even say that negative, in a more negative stand, that peer production is just plain free labor as a form of new slavery. So, as you see, the social implications are very different. But I'm not going to talk about this. What I'm going to talk is about this Californian ideology, which, as I said, it was not particularly built to describe peer production, but that is usually, it appears in many discourses, in many accounts of peer production and other things. So I'm going to make a very personal view of what this thing is, because it is not a very coherent ideology. It's a very heterogeneous perspective. And what is most remarkable of this ideology is that it mixes views from what are supposed to be very opposite positions. And, well, I would say Californian ideology is a mix of these 3 big things. One is the kind of hippie libertarian anarchy, sometimes spirit, plus the yuppie's entrepreneurial neoliberalist way of seeing society. And also a very important element is that it has a very technological deterministic view in all of it. Now, where is the Californian ideology mostly present. Well, I would say the Wired is the most important publication in this field. So I'm going to just very briefly comment what, from my point of view, very personal, I said, are the 6 main elements of this Californian ideology. The first one, as I said, is technological determinism. Now, technological determinism is a very old and very pervasive view on technology and on social consequences of technology. In the case of the Californian ideology, I would say that first there is what we call in this in the area of science and technology studies a lot of technological fixed, which means that almost every problem has a technological solution. So social problems are usually tackled as technical problems, and then technological solutions are the main X of solving them. Social change is the outcome of technological development, which in itself, technological development is something like autonomous. That means it follows a kind of natural evolutionary path where social intervention is mostly impossible. So society can just adapt to technological development, but not much change is possible. Inside Californian ideology, there is a very deep faith on the emancipatory potential of ICT, and following McLuhan's faith in the electronic agora, ICT is mostly the internet is thought as inevitably leading towards the turning of libertarian principles into social facts, some kind of fatality. So this is some kind of inevitable thing. Now, technological determinism has got another important element in itself, is this thought that technologies has a kind of inherent logic in itself. And what is the inherent logic of the internet? According to this ideology, well, basically it's networks. So internet is thought as being inherently democratizing and decentralizing. And then decentralization is always better than centralization. Networks are superior to hierarchies, and crowds always do better than experts. So this is more or less what this inherent logic is about. Peer-to-peer is also thought to be, for many people, the true spirit of this internet logic. And another important thing is that in thinking this way, internet is usually idealized as a space where social differences tend to disappear. So important phenomena in the internet like privatization, the fact that access to internet is almost totally controlled by large telecom companies, issues like surveillance, and many other social inequalities are usually not considered as very important in this Californian ideology. Another important thing is that everything is a bit mixed up. So it's an easy, normally things that like crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, free software, open source software, social networks, or peer production are just all in the same thing, and no disaggregation is done. We talk very easily about prosumers, hackers, and anything. So just as McLuhan described the electronic agora as a space where, with no special dimensions, the internet is thought as a space where power by governments and big business will be overthrown or will disappear in the future. The third element of this ideology is, of course, individualism. Freedom is thought as an attribute of individuals. In the internet, existing political powers are being replaced by free interactions between autonomous individuals. And collective action is thought as a secondary element. So in the first place, we have individuals, and collectivities. Social coordination is something that spontaneously emerges from individualistic and selfish behaviors. This is an idea, by the way, that has a very strong resemblance to the invisible hand in free market. In fact, there is I would say, a surprising translation of these libertarian principles into all liberal ideas. So the liberty of individuals, freedom of individuals, resembles very much freedom in the marketplace. And then, of course, the cyberspace is thought as a kind of ideal market where pure competition can really happen for the first time in history. Fourth element, we are all potential entrepreneurs. Everyone is a potential entrepreneur. We should run our lives as a business project plan. Life is a business plan. We should not just live our life, but manage it. We must become our own managers. Even personal identities is not something to be performed, to be built, but something to be managed, something for trading. Personal identity in the internet is conceived as a reputation capital, something we have to invest and manage. Politics. Well, just as Lenin said that socialism was Soviets plus electricity, in the Californian ideology turns that peer production politics is often conceived as Linux organization plus automation technology. So Linux, FLOSS, free software, is the model for political organization. This is, of course, a very easy, criticizable extrapolation because it is based on the assumption that if some model of organization works for building an online encyclopedia like Wikipedia, it should work for everything else. That is something that I've called, and other people call, of course, a postmodern formalization of politics. All that matters is a formal technical organization for structuring interaction among individuals, and content, political content, is almost reduced to copyright and patent issues. So there is a famous sentence by one of the leaders of the Pirate Party in Germany saying, "What we are offering is not a political program, but an operating system." There is a kind of also oversimplification of democracy. Wikipedia is often thought as democratic because anyone can participate, but that seems to resemble that view of democracy that tells that a small shop is less democratic than a big supermarket, because in a big supermarket you've got more options to do your shopping, which is very simplistic for political terms, but anyway. And my last point is about nature. And as in many other political ideologies, there is a constant resort to nature as a way of legitimizing political ideas. In the case of peer production, and for example, one of the last book by Benkler, one of the leading theoretics on this field, is basically devoted to finding examples in nature that show that collaboration is in the heart of human nature. But other naturalistic fallacies like this one are usually used in this field. And we are told that since neurons in our brain are structured in a particular network way, this is the way we should also structure our political interaction, which of course is a very old trick in many political ideologies. And that's all. Thank you very much. And now.
Okay. Hello. Thanks, Eduard, for inviting me to present. Let me first explain the title because I have to say that P2P is not my field of research and hasn't been in the past. But since I'm working in urban regeneration and urban politics, increasingly, both from the side of formal institutional strategies like it could be smart cities, fab labs, and so on the one hand, and from the other hand, from alternative movements, there is an emerging issue of P2P urbanism, DIY urbanism, intelligent urbanism, and so on, and it's how I get interested in the topic. And then what I will say is that first is what I will present here is just only a very fractionary, not really coherent first approximation to the general questions through the questions of P2P politics and the Californian ideology that Eduard presents to us. And this is the reason why I'm conscious that I'm going to muddy waters, because all of you know more than me about that. And since it's insecurity, I will do it through 6 quotes from other people, 4 statements, 2 poems to spice up a little bit the session, and end up with a question. Okay, then, first statement. P2P is a broad church. But I won't talk about this church that really exists. It's recognized by the Swedish government as a religion, the missionary church of copyism, a congregation of file sharers who believe that copying information is a sacred value. I don't want to talk, when I talk about broad church, I don't mean that. What I mean is that P2P is a lot of things. There is P2P exchange, P2P production, P2P knowledge, P2P consumption, P2P commerce, etc. Linked to very different concepts sometimes, like open source, open innovation, commons, cognitive capitalism, shared economy, collaborative economy, and so on, with different particular forms that are very different. That is hackerspaces, Wikipedia, urban gardens, fab labs, Linux, P2P hardware, P2P urbanism, and so on and so on. This is the reason why as well I think that talking about P2P and this broad chart is sometimes entering muddy waters, because you can find examples of everything there. Okay, in this context, I will follow the route of Eduard and following and first starting with a statement about ideology. Cognitive capitalism, Californian P2P. Well, the late get one that you prefer. Ideology is capitalism, and as Eduard said, where you mostly can see that is in the Wired magazine. You could see where the new whiteboards of P2P, like creative, be creative, the empowerment of the individual, like Ferran Adrià, very postmodern cuisine, very postmodern world, empowering people, dangerous, so-called dangerous ideas, new industrial revolutions, DIY, and so on. I think it's very encapsulated in the reference that Eduard passed us to discuss on Californian ideology. That the Californian ideology, sorry, I have to do it that way, rejects notions of community and of social progress, and seeks to chain humanity to the rocks of economic and technological fatalism. Once upon a time, West Coast hippies played a key role in creating our contemporary vision of social liberation. As a consequence, feminism, drug culture, gay liberation, and ethnic identity have, since the 60s, ceased to be marginal issues. That's good. Ironically, it is now California which has become the center of the ideology which denies the relevance of these new social subjects. As is what Eduard said before, and this is one of the aspects, I just only will deal with two aspects of the ideology, is that you could see through the market, through the mechanism that Eduard has explained it, what we have is transforming collective rights, collective struggles in the 60s and the 70s, how they become transform individual rights where the marketplace, the cyberspace, will put everybody in their own place, and I think this entails a lot of risk. The second issue is, as Fred Turner, in his biography of the founder of The Wire and the New Communalist in the 60s, says, the rhetoric of peer-to-peer informationalism, however, much like the rhetoric of consciousness out of which it grew, actively obscures the material and technical infrastructures on which both the internet and the life of the digital generation depend. Indeed, all internet, you know better than me, is a political construction, a political economic construction of the 60s, of the military defense industry, and a lot of the ways of organizing P2P and the digital economy, as in the Wired magazine usually promotes, you could see that it's based, for instance, in the cybernetics and all the labs of military defense that emerged in the United States in the 1940s during the war and developed during the Cold War. But just to put the ideas, as Eduard said, when the ideology of peer-to-peer is usually focused on saying how social differences disappear, the market puts everybody, just this quote of The Economist. The prosperity unleashed by the digital revolution has gone overwhelmingly to the owners of capital and the highest skilled workers. Over the past 3 decades, labor share of output has shrunk globally from 64 to 59. Meanwhile, the share of income going to the top 1% in America has risen from around 9% in the 1970s to 20% today. Unemployment is at alarming levels in much of the rich world, and not just for cyclical reasons. In 2000, 60% of working-age Americans were in work. Since then, the proportion has fallen, during good years as well as bad, to the current level of 59%. This is said by The Economist, not by Red Pepper or the Monthly Review. And if you go to San Francisco, you are aware of how San Francisco is evolving, you will know really that San Francisco has become a very unequal city when Starbucks waiters have to be homeless because they cannot afford living in the city. And the commuting times for non-skilled workers is amazing, the distance. In fact, there has been recently a lot of struggles around these issues, and there has been a lot of people throwing stones to the Google buses because it represents this kind of new form of social inequality through the economy. Therefore, this is my first conclusion. I will tell it about a poem. I mean, I like a lot one poem of Philip Larkin, Let's Be the Birds, a very famous poem in England, and basically it's that. They fuck you up, your wired and iPad. They might not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in hippie hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at once another throats. Men share on P2P to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any startup yourself. The italics are the words that I change. Okay, in this scenario, it brings me to another statement. Cognitive, Californian, blah, 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 capitalism is still capitalism. One of the things that theoretically has happened is that both from the right and from the left, the knowledge-based economy, the new industrial revolution, has been always termed like it changed capitalism. It's not the same capitalism. And always, from Richard Florida to Negri, you always say this kind of sentence that Marx was right with 19th century capitalism. It was about labor and exploitation, but now this is not anymore. This is because why? For Florida, it's very easy because it's not labor, it's knowledge. what produces value, and therefore knowledge is common, it's an input, it's an output for Negri and so on. So many times he's saying that this kind of sentence from the Grundy is about the general intellect. But I would rather change a little bit and coming back to two other Marxist authors like Guglielmo Archedi, that I think that rightly points out, well, knowledge, who produces knowledge? Knowledge is produced by labor. And labor and knowledge, that is a mental thing, that it looks to us that is immaterial, is produced because our neurons, our body produces this knowledge. I mean, knowledge is embodied in people, and is in the production line. It involves that, for instance, the video games, you have to have these workers that in their brain produce, create, with the help of tools, of technology, like computers and investment and capital, produce commodities like video games. First, then maybe it wasn't right that labor is not important. The second, as Guido Starosta in a wonderful long paper about a critique of cognitive capitalism, but just only taking one thing, he states, even in Taylor's manufacturing systems, the production system was divided between the sort of R&D, design and organization, and the production itself of the commodity. That was huge. Now we already have that, but precisely design and R&D are bigger than they were, but still you have all the processes and the steps, which means in that knowledge, we can say, is produced and takes place within capitalist social relations most of the times. That is produced value, that is appropriated by capital in many, most of it, and it produces exploitation, maybe of not physical labor at 19th century, but mostly abstract mental labor. This doesn't mean, and I am arguing that internet capitalism is like Fordist capitalism, not at all, but that at a very abstract level, we can see the same dynamics, that the concrete form might be very different, but still we have this kind of processes, and therefore of organizing through internet in a capitalist society. Yet, I finished this overhead on Friday, and on Sunday just take the newspapers and see that and say, oops, we have a problem. This article in the Observer is an article that assumes that it's not only that technology is taking out jobs of manufacturing or low skill. On the contrary, it's posing a real threat to highly qualified workers like doctors, lecturers, be aware, engineers, architects, and so on. And then this is like saying that in the long term, this article or many other articles that has been published recently are saying that capitalism is evolving in a way that labor is not necessarily important to capital. And in this sense, I just come back to the last book of David Harvey, The 7 Contradictions of Capital, where he states and goes to develop this kind of discussion. And he argues that if we believe what I said before, that social value, and value cannot only be produced even in a different way, but still produced by work, then replacing it with machines or robotic labor makes no sense, either politically or economically. You can take not a Marxist take, but there is another take that is the Keynesian take that then saying, yes, if we replace all laborers by technology, you have a problem of demand. Who will buy these things? Okay, in an equal society where there are the owners of capital that have a lot of money and the worker that doesn't have, it means that maybe the filthy rich. Other thing is that they can absorb all over the overproduction. Okay, but there is a tendency to go to that direction, according to Harvey. It's a contradiction and a tendency because individual entrepreneurs or corporations see labor saving innovation as critical to their profitability vis-a-vis competitors. This collectively undermines the possibility of profit. That is basically what as well Marx said in volume 1 of Capital, that what makes sense at the individual level might not make sense at collective level. it is true that still there are other ways of capital expanding and creating jobs. The point is that most of the reports were saying is that first, we have on the one hand that the pool of new proletarians in the world is becoming increasingly difficult and in the midterm will disappear. I mean, besides Africa and some parts of Central Asia, most of the population in the rest of the continents are already proletarized and making overproduction. The second thing that this crisis shows is that the real estate, or the second circuit of capital, as Harvey put it, on investment on real estate and infrastructure is not anymore having the effect of expanding the economy. Then we will have a problem in that sense. This is like authors like, for Harvey, this is a worry that is not by now, but in the long term. But for all actors like Jose Iglesias, this is Malthusian capitalism or free zone capitals, that this paradigm of high-tech utopia within capitalism, what the format it takes is that capitalism in the Malthusian sense doesn't need 5,000, 6,000 million people in the system, but it can work with 1 or 2,000, and the rest, I'm sorry for you, but get a life outside capitalism without any rights. Or this kind of, that basically even qualified workers will have a very precarious condition, and this is a thing that is very in line with the arguments of Negri, Hart, and all the cognitive capitalism. Okay. And this was my fourth statement, that cognitive, whatever capitalism will get worse. And then Harris asked precisely these questions. How will the resultant disposable and redundant populations live, let alone provide a market under such conditions? A viable long-term and imaginative answer to these questions has to be devised by any anti-capitalist movement. The contradictions that faces capital morph into a contradiction that necessarily gets internalized with anti-capitalist politics. This is the statement of Harvey, and this is, I will end up with first my question. Can anti-capitalist P2P be a part of the imaginative answer to capital? Well, I don't have an answer, but I see some problems that maybe we'll touch some of them later on, I think. Your face is that yes, okay. There are many experiences that try to do that, but they are always remaining on a small scale, and there has to be a lot of thinking of how this can be transformed to upscaling from these pilot experiences and how it can be transposable to other places. Then a very interesting idea that I share is all the new literature about the commons and how commons can be another organizing principle, but let's face it, there are two things that needs to be thought carefully. The first one is that, as Massimo De Angelis writes out, the commons is not only the solution, but it would be the problem, because it's one of the places where capital is going. On the lack of expanding through pressures on the labor force, because of at global level, it's ending up the pool of the reserve army, even if we have here 6 million people unemployed. That the real estate doesn't work, and so on. As a catalyzer, one of the spheres of the last frontiers of capital, amongst others, is to go for the privatization of commons. The second issue is that the limits of commons, because the commons, and this is who knows more than me, but the commons refers to a particular kind of goods and social practices, but can be extrapolated to all kind of production and sort of practices. We have to think about that. And fourth, like the Californian ideology story shows, I mean, those hippies in the 60s trying to make a better world were really co-opted by the system. I just only know that it's about the technological organization content, but the technology in itself, but as well, any answer should pass as well about cultural issues, like the idea of P2P, the politics subject, who will be the subjects that implement that, the social organization, how it's reproduce society and mobilize, and the economical, how production really ends up, how value is produced and shared, and how we deal with property. And this makes processes and decisions we should take. And because I don't have a concrete answer, I just leave you with Bertolt Brecht that have at least some guiding lines. That it takes a lot of things to change the world. anger and tenacity, science and indignation, the quick initiative, the long reflection, the cold patience, and the infinitive perseverance, the understanding of the particular case and the understanding of the ensemble. Only the lessons of reality can teach us to transform reality. Okay, thank you.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Eduard for inviting me. And I have to acknowledge that I'm a kind of outsider here, so I'm not really on peer-to-peer politics, peer-to-peer production. But as some of you may know, I have been working more on the environment, and I'm very interested in the role the environment, ecology, nature has in the political economy of capitalism, and more specifically on new urban imaginaries and new urban models. So at some point I'm quite interested in how nature on other concepts like ecology, self-sufficiency are mobilized in these new imaginaries we have been talking about. And that's why I would like to contrast two very different, in my opinion, examples. Two different examples that at the very first stance, they could seem that are similar, as they has a very similar spatial form, and both also draw on emerging concepts like commons, like collaborative economics, etc., etc. And in both cases, both mobilize has ecological concerns at the very core of its model. I am talking first about Fab Labs. In this case, I would like just to say a very few words about a very specific model of Fab Lab that deals with nature, which is the Valdaura Self-Sufficient Lab here in Collserola. And I will also, on the other hand, to bring the case of other post-capitalist alternative, in this case, Calafou. First of all, I have to acknowledge that I'm not an expert on them, and that's why I will draw on two different videos, self-explanatory videos, explaining those initiatives. Probably Maxi will be able to give more insights on the case of Calafou, as I'm aware he knows a lot about that. So let's start with the Valdaura Self-Sufficient Lab. This Fab Lab is sold as a self-sufficient habitat research center, which tries to demonstrate the possibilities of developing technologies and processes in order to sustainably produce energy and food from the land using only the natural resources available. This project draws a lot on permaculture principles, which are based on sustainable agriculture, regenerative and self-maintained habitat, and agricultural system model from natural ecosystems. So before going to the video, this is a kind of are the 8 cardinal points of the project, are copied from their website, so you can access and have a longer description. But I am going to read just the bold statement. First of all, we want to learn from nature what we should never have forgotten. So this concept of nature, this naturalization of well, this kind of nature knows best, and nature can structure the way we live. So we want a self-sufficient life. This concept of self-sufficiency is getting more and more important even in urban planning in Barcelona. So this concept is brought to the front. We want to learn by doing, transforming our everyday environments, sharing experiences with others. This is quite peer-to-peer, sharing in a kind of collective way. At the center of the project are human beings who need to learn to know themselves and learn from everything around them. At the same time, this kind of individualistic point of view, the individual as the one who shares their knowledge. We want to achieve a holistic vision of the environment with which we interact and learn to transform ourselves together with it. Again, the concept of nature and the key role of the environment. In so doing, we want to create an open, independent, and global community. We want to contribute to the renaturation of our cities. And finally, the project is the way, the process of transforming Valdaura into a new reality. So let's go to the video. Maybe we will not have time to watch the whole thing, but I think it's interesting to watch it as yeah. So, yeah, this was the first video on Valdaura, and we can see how the idea of Fab Labs, which are widespread in the world, are turning into a kind of green Fab Lab. So nature is progressively being an important part of the story, self-sufficiency, commons, etc. And now I would like to move to Calafou, which I'm not sure if you know the project, but at the very first stance could be a very similar project than that of Valdaura, as it is located in a former industrial building in a peri-urban area, and which has been turned into a kind of, let's say, self-sufficient eco-industrial post-capitalist colony. So, as extracted from the very web page of Calafou, which I recommend you to check, as it's very interesting, they aim to develop a network based on a network of cooperatives, individual projects, and housing in a collectivized area. This seeks to facilitate the sharing of ideas, goods, and resources to foster synergies in a natural way. A place for social innovation, technology, and policy based on self-responsibility and cooperation. A project where the productive economies are in the service of people, allowing their needs for access to resources and tools are not obstacles to the realization of their creative potential. And the four basic principles of Calafou, as you can see in the webpage, are self-management, assembly-run processes and decision-making by consensus, ecology and sustainability, and permaculture. So, to some extent, similar concepts to the former project of Valdaura. But let's check the video of Calafou in order to draw conclusions whether we are talking about the same thing, even if we are mixing concepts, or we are talking about radical different socio-ecological projects.
Estamos en Calafou por unos campamentos de la cooperativa integral y también para ayudar a rehabilitar este espacio durante estos inicios del proyecto.
Me interesa la idea de como una nueva sociedad alejada de toda la contaminación mediática, de consumo, porque pienso que tengo muchas inquietudes sociales y creo que esto es una oportunidad para mí para poderlas encauzar.
Y bueno, venimos con la idea de ayudar en la rehabilitación y la limpieza del espacio, porque creemos que es un proyecto estratégico, además promovido por la cooperativa integral.
Bueno, yo estoy aquí en Calafou para vivir y ahora ayudando aquí en limpiar y habilitar las viviendas.
Puedo desarrollar un montón de actividades que fuera de aquí no puedo desarrollar. Puedo participar del jardín de infantes, de cuidar niños. Puedo dar aulas de lo que aprendí.
Y sobre todo el tema de la convivencia, ¿no? Yo estoy más centrada en lo que es la facilitación del grupo de persones.
La manera pues, de canviar el nostre dia a dia en sortint del sistema capitalista i ser més coherents amb els principis que tenim.
La cooperativa integral es un proyecto muy ambicioso que incluye, digamos, todas las necesidades que pueda tener una persona fuera del capitalismo.
Entonces, pues bueno, nació en mayo del 2010 y ahora ya llevamos algo más de un año y estamos en pleno funcionamiento, aún desarrollando muchos de esos objetivos para poder llegar a completar una autoorganización suficiente como para vivir de otra forma sin necesidad de del dinero capitalista y de sus multinacionales.
En ese sentido, bueno, ya van surgiendo alrededor de todo el territorio nuevas ecosarsas, que son bioregiones que se asocian a nivel local para generar dinámicas de intercambio, fomentar esa economía alternativa y generar proyectos autogestionados a nivel local.
Desde necesidades de comida, de vivienda, de formación, de intercambios, es una concepción muy amplia de necesidades cubiertas a través de otros medios alternativos que no sean los capitalistas.
Yo creo que es la única alternativa que tiene esta sociedad capitalista. El capitalismo como proceso ha muerto, está muerto, y la única salida es el cooperativismo.
La cooperativa integral y California están más enfocadas a la parte de la autogestión, de construir alternativas al margen del Estado. Quizá en el 15M pues hay mucha diversidad de propuestas en ese sentido, también propuestas que miran hacia el poder, propuestas que miran hacia las alternativas.
Es el mismo movimiento, o sea, la gente que ha protestado, la gente que se ha indignado, va a buscar en todo el mundo salidas.
Bueno, me parece algo fantástico que está sucediendo. Creo que es una energía de la que todos estamos, de la que participamos así con el corazón, ¿no? Porque estamos de acuerdo con lo que está pasando.
Pero no podemos solo quejarnos, o sea, si decimos que su sistema no funciona, tenemos que desarrollar uno que funcione, no basado en la competición, en la explotación de la peña, sino en la colaboración.
Una salida cooperativista y una salida de colonia es el paso siguiente al 15M.
Son propuestas abiertas que cualquier persona puede participar en ellas, son propuestas asamblearias y son proyectos que miran a largo plazo, ¿no? que quieren construir otra forma de vida, pero comparten una participación social, por lo cual están muy implicadas al mismo tiempo en un movimiento más masivo.
Y poder darle a mi hijo también un lugar que crezca en la realidad, digamos.
Yeah, so basically I think this video is quite nice because it serves as an example of how similar and at the same time how radically different some concepts can be. So concepts like self-management, self-sufficiency, commons, how differently they can be mobilized in order to foster alternatives to the current socioeconomical crisis. And so I don't have any kind of answer, but I'm quite intrigued by the implication of each of those different models which claim to be alternatives to the business as usual situation might imply. And to some extent, and drawing on Ramon's discussion on the commons, sometimes I'm quite, not skeptical, but I'm quite reluctant sometimes to use the word commons as among many other words, because at some point I think they can even, to some extent, foster a kind of depolitization or hollowing out of the political. I'm not sure that we can brand commons many things of our urban life, and I'm not sure if it may help to some kind of radical transformative project to do so. So the aim of this presentation was to some extent to open the floor to discuss about all these new concepts and whether they are really useful whether they are not useful, and how they can be co-opted and reappropriated by radically different projects. Yeah, and so this was basically what I had to say. So thank you.
How does this work? Okay. I didn't bring any slides, so I will just talk to you. Is it possible to turn off the projector? Good. So, as before, these are some sketches from my research, and I tried to bring the more wide-ranging ones, because that's a more, interesting and maybe inspiring part of the research. And I will not try to ground these ethnographically in this presentation. So I would like to start with the idea that there are two lines of analysis in the social sciences, or at least in the books that I was reading in these few years. First, there is one that I will speak in very, very broad terms here, but there is one that looks at the critique of capitalism, that looks at the development of capitalism in the 20th century into the 21st century. So it would be Harvey and the autonomists are talking about forms of subsumption. The autonomists are talking about social factory. There is this notion that the empire is the expansion of capital in the empire is internal rather than external, with the end of the decolonization, formal decolonization of the world. And on the other hand, we have the discourse around, so here in the critique of capitalism, there is a contrast between the old capitalism and the new capitalism, basically. And the argument is that the new one is definitely a more evil one. The exploitation is reaching deeper into the soul of the workers and so on. And on the other hand, when I started to do the literature review about how peer production is theorized, I realized that most of the arguments contrast the old capitalism with this collaborative mode of production. And this one, this other line, has much more positive claims about how this transformation in production affects society, and these transformations are evaluated in a much more positive light. And well, the basic argument is that it is more or less, it is not really, it is only in a few authors, it is really grounded in a like proper traditional Marxist reading. But of course, when we talk about peer production, it does have these Marxist overtones, where the basic argument is that the forces of production developed faster than the relations of production. And this is where the tensions and the conflicts, for example, around copyright came from. I will not rehearse these arguments because I guess most of you are familiar with it. And so, for example, when I was looking at how hacker culture is conceptualized, usually there are several histories of hacker culture and analysis, but most of them are endemic histories. So they try to understand hacker culture, even if they have a historical bent, as an internal development. So there is this founding myth of MIT or hobbyist groups or the two together. And from these developments, the kind of essence of hacker culture materializes. But I think that these accounts don't really connect or are not sufficiently integrated with the critique of capitalism, which is the first line of argument that I was trying to point out. So what I would like to read somewhere, and I hope that other people write similar stuff, and some work has already been done. But basically the bigger project would be to understand, for example, my small research sites, the hackerspaces, or hacker culture in general, or even maybe peer production as a social practice based on social history. So grounded in the history of capitalism and the history of societies, rather than internalist history of one scene or one culture. So I give an example, and this is what was mentioned before a lot, is the commons. So the argument is that copyright can be interpreted as fencing the commons. So there are these new technologies. With these new technologies, people can produce, for example, knowledge commons. And then big companies like Elsevier, as Eduard sometimes says, just fence this knowledge. And I think this is more or less a good analysis, but what would be an interesting question is to see why this commons emerges, other than because we have computers. So how does this integrate into kind of the strategic development of capitalism? And I came up with this idea of free-range minds. It's like free-range chickens that, you know, when you go to the supermarket, you can buy chickens, or you can buy eggs, which can roam freely, and they are a kind of more ethical choice. So maybe commons can be envisioned as a kind of territory, breeding ground created by capitalism for these free-range minds to go and to produce, which can be harvested later. And the creations coming out of these free-range minds are much more tasty, much more ethical, and much more ecological. So here, on a kind of larger scale, this would mean that with the completion of the of colonization, when capitalism didn't really have any outside anymore to subsume, it creates its own outside, this artificial virtual world, which can be exploited, and where let's say the formal subsumption of the goods can take place. So usually such biopolitical exploitation is theorized as, for example, stealing time, so that you can see the people using their mobile phones in their free minutes. And through this, they are sustaining media monopolies on the internet. But this is something that basically runs on the idle time, on the time that the workers have between what is still considered traditionally as the usual work in the office and whatever. This is one aspect of, let's say, even this mode of production. But if we look at hacker culture, we find that, maybe hackers can be understood as the ultimate workers, the ideal model of the cognitive worker, because they are dedicated, they are autonomous, they are self-programmable, they are self-organized, they are highly skilled, they are technologically inclined, they are creative, and at the end of the list, they also work for free. So the hackerspaces that I study are more or less on the most authentic or most community-based, most fringe of capitalism, from the range of shared machine workshops which exist, like co-working places, fab labs, media labs, incubators, and so on. But what I see there is that they pose, they are places of production. So people do things there, they develop things. Basically, what people do there can be interpreted as an industrially relevant hobby. So, for example, people who are building tracks of model trains and little cities as miniatures. They are also collaborating with each other and producing things. But just because of the topic of the collaboration, the hackerspaces more often produce things that can be developed into products, that can produce spin-off companies, or simply solve bigger or smaller problems in the free software world. And it's quite maybe disillusioning to look at all these usually young male people putting all their energy and all their life into their projects, and then saying that they produce a commons, and then of course seeing companies just taking these and using them in their own business model. Actually, I guess one link to at least what California is trying to do is to apply ideas that were, I believe, most precisely formulated by Dimitri Kleiner, where he talks about venture communism. So he advocates licenses where the conditions of using the end product of the work, would be available on the market, but at the same time available for free to be used by cooperatives. So this would be one strategy to avoid, which is called basically the application as a service loophole in the free software licenses. So I'm running out of time, so I won't go into more details. Basically, what I would like to point out that here we have a concept of not just a mode of production or a new way of collaboration, but a whole new man. So it has a concept of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be a good citizen, what are the properties of this new citizen. So this citizen is relentlessly producing. It pursues its own ideals in a way that is good for society. This person is collaborating with other people. And these all sound like positive ideals, but at the same time, when there is the production of ideals, they also become a selection mechanism. And as it was already pointed out, capitalism at the moment doesn't need so many people to operate. So maybe these criteria can be the criteria for selecting which section of the population is worth to keep and which section of the population should be excluded from society. Basically, the question in the interpretation of peer production then, one more point that let's say when we look at a new mode of production emerging, one of the analyses, one of the ways to approach this is to say, because you have to answer the question, how can two modes of production operate within the same system? So, for example, Jacob Righi calls this articulation. So there is a new mode of production which have to articulate itself inside the communist mode of production, but or inside the capitalist mode of production. But this would mean that if it can successfully articulate itself, it can gradually become a hegemonic mode. And on the other hand, if we look at analysis from word systems theory, we see that capitalism has always been barely the hegemonic form of production, and it always needed other forms of production like feudalism during the colonialist times or the family economy and so on, that kind of it can parasite on. So here the question would be if we are talking about the subsumption of peer production by capitalism, or if peer production could successfully articulate itself in a capitalist mode of production. But I don't think that this is simply a theoretical question. I think that the answer to this question depends on how we can understand and formulate these processes. And finally, it is only decided in the actual social struggles. Thank you.